It is really pleasing to be able to stand here and support, albeit with reservations, a piece of legislation that is about having some action in helping women escape domestic violence, women and their families. So we are supportive of this bill, which will formally establish the right of all workers to 5 days unpaid family and domestic violence leave, but that's the kicker in it. It's the unpaid bit of it. And that, unfortunately, makes this legislation a bit tokenistic. Clearly the government is following, not leading on this issue, following a decision by Fair Work Australia. And what we really need to see is paid domestic violence leave, and that would require a government to lead on that issue, and sadly we're not seeing that. It is a government, a Liberal government, that has said a lot of words about domestic violence in the 2.5 years that I've been in this place, but there has been so little action. What the amendment today will allow for is that workers can maintain secure employment and be able to access the services and do the things they need to do to escape violence. Many of those things are only able to be done in normal 9 to 5 business hours. So while, look, there's no doubt it is a step in the right direction, it's a pretty small step and it certainly doesn't go far enough. I think we should just look at the problem that we face. 1 woman a week will be killed due to domestic violence in Australia. That is really nothing short of an epidemic. It's absolutely a national tragedy, and for every life that is lost, there are enormous consequences for families and for children. 1 in 6 Australian women has experienced physical or sexual violence by a current or former partner. And over 60% of women who experience violence from a current partner are working. So this is not just something that affects you in the privacy of your own home. It affects you every moment of every day in your workplace, when you're picking kids up from school, when you're trying to cook the dinner at night. It affects every moment of your being if you're in a violent relationship. We also know that when a woman is able to leave a violent relationship, that's when she is most at risk. It's the single most dangerous time for her. And the newspapers have far too many stories showing just what that danger looks like. The practicality of it is that the cost of leaving an abusive relationship is high. There's the cost of relocation, maybe even including breaking a lease, medical and counselling bills, moving house costs, or even the loss of access to a car. And then there's just the time involved. It doesn't take hours to sort out legal and medical things, new schools for children, new childcare arrangements. It takes days and weeks. Now, I have not been in a violent relationship, but I have had to suddenly change where I live as a result of a fire destroying my house. And that experience of one day, one moment having a place to live and the next moment not, gave me a tiny insight into just the logistics of it. Changing addresses on everything, your licence, your credit card, your Medicare card, doing the logistics of re-establishing your life, let alone finding somewhere to live at short notice, including with children. So I really think when we look at the number of days here, 5 days unpaid leave is really barely scratching the surface on what may be required in a worst-case scenario for families, for women, for their children. The Australian Services Union is in a unique position to see the importance of paid domestic violence leave. Their workers are in the front line of family violence. They're in refuges, they're in women's health services, they're in community groups. These are the people who pick up the pieces when lives fall apart and support women and their children going through this whole gamut of domestic violence. Now, the ASU recognises that their own workers should have access to paid domestic violence leave as well. They recognise that paid domestic leave prevents further harm being done to someone's long-term health and well-being and reduces the risk of that person facing poverty and homelessness. So really what we're talking about is something that at the right time makes an enormous difference for what follows. There's no doubt this place needs to do more to support survivors of domestic violence, and Rose Batty has made the point that knowing her workplace supported her while she had to leave to do things like attending court hearings would have made a real difference. It's the workplace where actually it can sometimes be an escape from the violence, but it can be possibly the single most supportive environment to follow through on your decision to leave. Deputy Speaker, last year Labor announced that a shortened Labor government will introduce 10 days of paid domestic violence leave into the National Employment Standards. We have listened to survivors, to frontline workers, to businesses, to the union movement and to organisations who deal with domestic violence daily, and their message is really clear. It's so clear that one government that very rarely gets what the community wants, the New South Wales Liberal government, has actually introduced 10 days paid domestic violence leave for New South Wales public sector employees. And I congratulate them on that. I'm pleased to see that they understand the impact it can have on people, not just on people but on workplaces as well. The government, New South Wales government, has brought in their 10 days of paid domestic and family violence leave per year for every public sector employee, which includes, of course, teachers, nurses, police, and that will come in from the 1st of January next year. I particularly note the words that were said when they made that announcement, and the Minister for Prevention of Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault, Prue Goward, with whom I was a journalist in this place more than 30 years ago, said this. She said, "Paid work is critical in providing financial stability to people experiencing domestic and family violence, which is why the New South Wales government is introducing this important reform to leave entitlements." So it is a purely pragmatic decision as well as a hugely supportive decision for a government to make, and it is very disappointing that this government has not seen the logic of it. It's been noted already in this chamber, but I should also note that New Zealand has brought in 10 days paid domestic violence leave, and the way they saw it was that it was part of a whole of society response, really signalling that this issue is not something that police alone deal with or courts alone deal with. So there's symbolism to this as well, particularly where we're talking about paid domestic violence leave. One of the arguments put by those opposite and others about why not mandating paid domestic violence leave is that it's a cost. But honestly, good, small employers wouldn't think twice about giving their staff time off if they knew domestic violence was involved. They might not have a legal obligation to intervene, but I think, and as a small employer, I certainly would have felt I had a moral obligation to my staff, to my team. Small businesses do know the economic costs of domestic violence to their business, as do large corporations, and the costs are high. The figures vary between researchers, but they're in the millions of dollars. You know, that is what's currently being lost because of a lack of action on paid domestic violence leave. Some of those costs include lost productivity, absenteeism and staff turnover. An academic working in the gender-related violence studies area, Ludo McFerrin, his work says that it's a mistake for businesses to think domestic violence is a personal issue that doesn't affect the workplace. And in fact, he points out that all staff in a workplace are affected. He tells with brutal honesty the reality that victims of domestic abuse talk to their co-workers, and it's often these people who try and help them, and then that's the very thing that puts the co-workers at risk. So the message that Ludo gives to employers is that domestic violence ends up costing them money through lost productivity, but it also affects the safety of all staff. Yet another good reason to be extending this 5 days unpaid leave into something more meaningful. There are already small businesses in my electorate doing enormous things to support their employees. And I'm not going to name the business and I'm not going to name the location where they are, but there is a business in my electorate in the Blue Mountains where one of the staff members did need to leave. They were in a violent relationship and they needed to leave, and they needed to go a long way away. And this business didn't think twice. This was a valued staff member. So they supported this person in leaving, in relocating to another city. And it wasn't just short-term support. They have continued to employ this person, who now works remotely and does her job for this business to the same high standard that she was doing it. It was a small business that was willing to make some adaptations to make it work, and that will have changed the life outcome for this woman. So there are small businesses who go well beyond that because they know that it's so important retaining valuable employees, and actually a bit of flexibility and a bit of help can improve productivity. People who've experienced domestic violence do need support, and for many their workplaces will be some of the most supportive mechanisms that they have around them. We know big companies are also taking far more action on this already than this parliament is taking today. Many companies already provide 10 days paid domestic violence leave, including companies like Carlton and United Breweries, Telstra, NAB, Virgin Australia, IKEA and Qantas. And these employers and many others really pave the way to help reduce the stigma that often accompanies domestic violence. So too many of Australia's unions have been campaigning for paid domestic and family violence leave over many years, and that's led to some subsequent coverage in many Australian workplaces. But this parliament has a role to play in it. We really could be doing more. We could do more than 5 days unpaid leave. 94% of employers agree that employers should take a leadership role in educating their workforce about respectful relationships between men and women. And I know many workplaces would be willing to take a next step to be able to support staff and ideally retain those staff as they've moved through very difficult circumstances. Deputy Speaker, the effects of domestic violence are not only felt while the abuse is ongoing, but they can reverberate for many years after the violence has stopped. And this has substantial consequences for career progression and also for potential future earnings. Where someone has had to leave their job, where their leave has run out and they've exhausted all other avenues and felt they had no option but to leave work to be able to escape their situation, that's where we do even greater economic damage, not just to that individual and her family, but to our whole economy. Victims of domestic violence are more likely to experience food insecurity, to struggle to find affordable housing and to cover the basic essentials like utility bills. Domestic violence victims are more likely to experience anxiety over their ability to support their children, even when compared to others on low incomes. And in fact, it's all intensified for low-income women. So, whether it's a few hours out of a day that someone misses, whether it's a whole day, a few days a week or a few months out of the year, all that missed employment translates into lost income. Providing paid family violence leave means we're not asking victims to choose between foregoing the necessary support that they need for the sake of financial security. And I think that's a very minimal thing for us to be able to do. Certainly Labor is committed to doing this and making sure that victims may be better able to weather the storm of domestic and family violence. We have our $88 million safe housing program, $49 million additional for legal aid funding if we are successful at the next election. Along with things like banning cross-examinations, which we have called for a very long time so that victims of domestic violence cannot be cross-examined by the perpetrator. These are some of the things that we can do, and our announcement last week of an $18 million anti-domestic violence program is another step to make sure that we're doing, as a parliament and as a society and as an economy, everything we can to make this place better for those who have found themselves in a violent situation, but have the bravery to leave that situation.